What I'm doing. All right. Do you both have the little accept buttons or anything like that? Or the
Oh yes. Wait a second.
I assent. I assent.
There we
All
go.
right. Well, I'm just feeling like a kid in a candy shop, so excited, or a kid on Christmas morning, the 11th day of Christmas. I hope that's an appropriate feeling. I'm excited to be talking to the two of you about a topic that I'm, hungry for conversation partners in. It's one that's interested me and also kind of confused me for a long time. So I'm just delighted to have folks that will chit chat about it. But let me introduce the two of you quickly and then pitch a topic out there. And I'm not going to presume that we know what the topic is that we're talking about entirely because it's that kind of a topic.
Fine,
Uh,
because I never know
I-
what I'm talking about anyway.
So, roughly speaking, my favorite term for it is the meta historical human fall. But before we get into favorite terms and what it is we're actually trying to talk about, um, Dr. Matthew Milliner is a professor of art and archaeology at Wheaton, Princeton University PhD, and has written two books, Chesterton and the Native Peoples, and as well as a book on an icon of Mary. And Addison Hodges Hart is also an author and sort of semi-retired in Norway, married to an iconographer there. And I think your most recent book is a collection of ghost stories. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yep.
Which
And
which means will fit perfectly with a discussion on the meta historical.
absolutely.
And he has a check mark on Substack, which is not easy to do. Not easy to do.
Wow. Yes.
Oh,
So yeah, you can find
I'll watch it.
Matthew's writing all over the place. He's written a lot with comment, and also you have a Substack, Millinerd, that you're kind of messing
Well,
around.
yeah, it's a shadow of my blog because no one blogs anymore. Oh well.
Yes, it is. It really has kind of taken over. And the Pragmatic Mystic is Substack where you can find Addison Hodges Hart's updates and essays. And I also Substack at Copious Flowers. Um, so, um, and I'm Jesse Hake. I should probably say that as well. I my day job, I'm the director at Classical U, which is a training program for teachers interested in the classical liberal arts and great books. And I do a lot of writing and reading and chit-chatting about delightful topics. It's my great privilege in some of my free time. So, yeah, I thought it might be interesting actually to say each one of us to say what we think we're talking about and some of our favorite terminology and kind of key points of contact. I did want to reference up front early as well. The most recent thing I've read from you, Matt, is in Comment Magazine at the Field Museum with Father Chiliard. That's the most recent thing on this topic that I've read from you, and that essay references probably my most substantial effort to write anything down. You have a link in there to an essay that I submitted for Eclectic Orthodoxy, old school blog,
Yeah.
faithful, hasn't gone the Substack route. I thought Father, Al would appreciate that little plug.
He's
Uh,
holding on. He's holding on.
that's right.
Old media.
Hmm.
I almost felt a chastisement from him at one point in a private communication when I was like, I think I'm going on to Substack. He's like, oh no. But my little essay there, Human Fall from Another Kind of Time, is probably the most significant attempt. And that's really largely just abusing your brother, little brother, David Bentley Hart, and dragging out everything he's ever said on the topic. I think when he commented at the bottom of it, he said, well, that was thorough. I think
That's
literally
how he would
every
say it too.
every reference he's ever made in any interview, in any essay, I think I pretty much
Yeah.
put them all in there. It was pretty ridiculous. But then you have an essay, Addison, at the Pragmatic Mystic, Time, Eternity, the Creation and Prayer, which I think is one of the more recent pieces I've seen you reflecting on this topic with. But anyway, with if that sounds good to you guys, what if we each sort of say what we would call the subject and kind of what some of the touch points and maybe key thinkers are, just briefly, and then we'll jump in with questions for each other. How does that sound?
Great.
Go ahead.
All right. You wanna-
Sure, I'll start. I mean, I remember being at the Met one afternoon in New York and seeing Giovanni de Paolo's Creation of the World and the Expulsion from Paradise. And you have this Adam and Eve scenario, and then you have a circle into which the fall creates a subgenre of creation. And I thought that this idea was original. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's the meta-historical fall in art history and no one's written about it. And then some brilliant person wrote the maybe it was you, Jesse, the meta-historical fall Wikipedia page where that is the illustration. And was it you?
Yeah, I wrote
Well
that.
done.
I wrote
Well
that
done.
article and picked out that illustration.
Yeah, and that's where I said, okay, there's other people onto this. There's other people onto this.
Now, I did not know whether or not it was legitimate. So now,
Yeah, well,
you've given me some scholarly
it is
information.
perfect. It illustrates it in a perfect way. And so you might say, why is an art historian even talking about this? That there'll be one reason. There's that. Let's just back up for a moment. I remember grappling with evolutionary thought as an undergraduate, and this conflicting, as it always does for Americans, with a traditional high view of scripture, as it is often said, and being really cornered by that. It was either I continue to hold to this high view of scripture or commit intellectual suicide. And I believe in God. And so I'm dead in Christ. So fine, I'll commit intellectual suicide if that's what it comes to. And yet, finally coming to an understanding, thanks to wiser professors who fortunately did not guide me into a young earth creationism. And they did so while saying, you can hold on to your high view of scripture. And it was the poverty of evangelical mindset that even led to that dilemma in the first place. And fortunately, I had serious geologists and chemists surrounding me who could assist me. And as I'm doing that, you're kind of find yourself in this muddy middle where faced with the evolutionary evidence, you sort of say, well, yeah, I believe in a fall in allegorical sense. And even though all the patristic authors are still going to hold on to this literal Adam and Eve, you're in this gray area. And you kind of come to this conclusion that, yeah, it really doesn't make sense. I want to take paleontology seriously. I want to take evolutionary biology seriously. And I just really don't know how it holds together. I have a colleague here who just retired, John Walton, The Lost World of Genesis 1, who tries to help us in that area. There are several books out about it. There's one called When Did Sin Begin by a scientist at Calvin University who tries to hold these things together. Jamie Smith edited a wonderful book on Genesis and the Fall, where Aaron Riches and others chime in. And my colleagues now in the sciences at Wheaton have a wonderful book that essentially trying to deprogram a young earth creationist, but also permit them to hold on to that view if they choose, and to say, here's what science offers you. Here are the 4 or 5 different options that you can choose from as to how to reconcile this. And Jesse, this is why this is such a big deal for me. And all the literature that I just mentioned, and forgive me if I'm wrong, these are very smart people who are putting this together. I don't think what you're offering is presented to people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why for me, it was, oh my gosh, this enables me to hold on to it all together. For one, I never gave up on a historical quote unquote Adam. And part of the reason is because I read the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I was teaching that as a graduate student. I taught the confirmands class when I was a seminary. It was my intern thing, even though I wasn't Roman Catholic myself. And it says, we should be a little cautious about giving up on Adam and Eve altogether. And Aaron Riches in this, I think I'm getting his name right, in this wonderful volume, holds on Genesis and the fall, holds on to a historical Adam. And it's almost seen as like, how quaint, how cute, it's like, oh, look at him holding on to that. this view that you're presenting, that you're unearthing from this Russian bishop, and which has been on offer in other places that we'll discuss in a moment, finally, it really feels like it has all come together beautifully. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin for me was a necessary stopgap for a time. Like I never was fully comfortable with what he was offering, especially when he congratulates Mao's army as the dawning of the new Christ humanity. And when he says, yay, look, nuclear energy, isn't this going to be wonderful for the evolutionary of the cosmos? He makes some really stupid mistakes. And so when you mention Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, people laugh at you and they mock you. And his fanboys and fangirls are the worst of all, because they're like, oh yeah, and they love the fact that he was censured by the Vatican. They're like, and I want to be censured too, because that must mean that I'm part of the vanguard of the new humanity and it's Galileo all over again. It's like, don't give yourself that favor. Come on. And so the Pierre Teilhard de Chardin circles are pretty boring sometimes. And this really does answer, for me, so many questions. And this meta-historical fall that we're discussing, I'm not going to leave it to me to unpack those details. There are the places we just mentioned for listeners who are wondering what we're talking about. But I'll just say it in a sentence and then we'll pass it on to Addison. What this is saying is that everything the Genesis is saying is true in the ultimate sense. And if you want to say literal, you can say it's literally true, but it's speaking mythically about events that actually happened and humans that actually existed, but it is outside the boundaries of what any geologist, archaeologist, paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, or could ever get at, because it's the prologue to the world. And the Big Bang happens, and that spawns the world as it exists today. And it makes sense of the chaos of the world that we're presented in. It makes sense of the tsunami that David so beautifully writes about. And that when you see the death of a child, you are not seeing the face of God, you're seeing the face of his enemy. That gorgeous and necessary line from translating from the brothers Karamazov into our time. That God is at war with elements of this cosmos that we are in, and he is in the process of overcoming it, and Easter is the first fruits of that. So that's why I have the same, you use the kid in the candy store, thrill with these ideas. I've been waiting for these ideas for a very long time, and it staggers me how rare they are discussed. And as we'll discuss shortly, it's not just in Eastern Orthodoxy. I've found sources beyond that where this material is mentioned as well. So I can still hold on to my high view of Scripture and only get higher. And science is just like, bring it on. There's just no problem anymore. You don't have to go back to the Scopes monkey trial, for goodness sakes.
So I guess I have the floor at the moment, or
I have yielded the floor. I have yielded the floor.
Well, that's very kind of you. No, I think with me, I'm not sure where my views fall, whether it's a meta-historical would, technically be considered a meta-historical view or not, because I held a view very similar. I don't know if I picked it up somehow in the ether indirectly from Teilhard de Chardin or not, but literally for the last 40 years or so, pretty much my understanding of the fall is pretty much what I put down in very briefly in that Substack article that you mentioned, Jesse. I can't remember the title of it, but you mentioned it.
Time, Eternity, the Creation, and Prayer.
Time, Eternity, Creation, and Prayer. Okay. Those are four interesting things. Somehow I weaved that all together in like 1,400 words. Don't ask me, I don't remember. But that's basically the view I hold. And that is, I think, somewhat different than, say, what Bishop Basil is discussing in the works that are being translated and all that. It's funny that, Matt, you mentioned art, because the other place where I actually discussed this a little bit was in my book on Thomas Cole.
Yes.
the
in his
voyage,
Eden
voyage
paintings,
of life.
precisely.
Yeah. Where if you pick up that book, you'll find actually I say something very much along the same lines as that Substack article, the title of which I
You just cut off a little bit, so you'll have to circle back.
gotten basically, or the fall. And, okay,
You're back. You're back.
You're back.
I'm back. Okay.
Yep.
I'm sorry. I think there's a my router is not altogether healthy or something.
That's all right. You were just talking about coal, the book on coal.
Okay. Yeah. I was just saying it's the other place where I think in print I have spoken about my own views, which are somewhat similar to Tailored's, and that is that creation is continuing. We haven't, in a sense, hit the seventh day of the Sabbath rest yet.
Yeah.
That's still the goal, but that what you're seeing is a tug of war between God's creative work or energies, or however you want to express it, and the chaotic, the unformed, which draws us as a gravitational pull backwards. In some sense, and that what you see is that redemption is, and the incarnation obviously is part of creation itself. That what we see in Christ is or not a continuation, but pretty much the epicenter of creation itself. That this is what brings creation from what we would call recreation, but it brings it towards the resurrection, which is the ultimate deification and God all in all that we see in what is it, 1 Corinthians 15:22, I think it is. That's the direction that we're heading. So I'm not sure if that's a meta historical view or not. I don't necessarily. I'm not saying there's not a historical Adam and Eve, whatever that is. What I am saying is that, and get back to the Thomas Cole thing. The reason that I mentioned it in the Thomas Cole pictures is because Cole apparently has a view of the fall that's something like that.
Interesting.
And that his 4 paintings, The Voyage of Life, are in fact a depiction of the coming into the world, the loss of a paradisial childish state, the sort of the childhood of Adam idea that you find in Irenaeus and all that, and the struggles of life, the redemption that takes place, and the ultimate union with God in the fourth and final picture. And if you read Cole carefully, you'll find that he's already not necessarily buying into a historical or even a meta-historical, but that this is happening all the time, that the fall of Adam is a constant. It's happening in every human life. And so that's where we see that occurring. So that's my view in a nutshell, which you can, I think that's what Tailored more or less says. So to come back to him, when I read Teilhard de Chardin and his view of that, I remember it struck me that, somehow we're on the same wavelength there, which means I do not buy. By the way, I don't follow him. That technology and human progress or any of that has anything to do with fall and redemption. Redemption and creation are entirely God's work.
Yeah.
And fall is what God is saving us from falling backwards, if you will, going back towards the bestial, going back towards the uncreated and the formless. So, all right, that's my bit.
And Addison, he does say that that there is a God who's completely outside the system, and there must be an inbreaking from beyond. Unfortunately, his followers don't. His followers sort of deliberately forget those passages, become complete Hegelians. That God needs us to realize himself as we're pushing on through, and it really is tragic what they've done with him. And when you actually read what he says, he does have those moments, but he also, in my understanding, he does actually give up on the historical Adam and Eve altogether.
Yeah.
because he doesn't have the options that we're discussing right now. And Bishop Basil is clear about that. He's looking at the reality, and this is what Merton says in his review of Henri de Lubac's book on Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, where Henri de Lubac, a fellow Jesuit, is trying to defend Pierre from his detractors.
Yeah.
And Merton, I think it's pretty fair. He's like, okay, Henri, you're being a little too generous here, because Pierre doesn't understand the tradition. And when he abandons what he calls the Alexandrian view of
Yeah.
the ancient Christian fathers, he does not know that tradition. He does not know the depth of the patristic insight. And so that's the downside to Teilhard de Chardin. He didn't have what we're talking about right now. But I'm love that what you pointed out that Thomas Cole does. Can I share one brief thing to echo onto that?
Sure.
So this is from the wonderful book Meditations on the Tarot, which is not, as I'm sure your listeners know, a recommendation of employing tarot cards for predicting the future, but instead it's to using them as a tool for evangelism, to bring those who are in that realm into the fullness of faith. By anonymous, but we know it's afterwards by Hans Urs von Balthasar, and we now know it was a man named Valentin Tomberg, a convert to Catholicism from anthroposophy. And he says exactly what Addison just said. I love this. Now it is in we ourselves that there is to be found the Edenic layer, or that of paradise and the fall, of which an account is found in the book of Genesis and Moses. Do you doubt the essential truth of this account? So in other words, Tomberg is saying, you want proof? I'll give you proof. Descend into the depths of your own soul. Descend as far as the roots, to the sources of feeling, will, and intelligence, and you will know. You will know, i.e., your will have certainty that the biblical narrative is true in the most profound and authentic sense of the word, in the sense that you must deny yourself, deny the witness of your inner structure of your own soul, in order to be able to doubt the intrinsic truth of Moses's account. The descent into the depths of your own soul in meditating upon the account of paradise in Genesis will render you incapable of doubt. Like, we are all Adam, we are all Eve, we are all fallen. This is encoded into our DNA. It's the story of the human psyche. That is true, but also it is true in that metahistorical sense. You can have it all. You can have all what science gives you. You can have the allegorical sense of Adam and Eve within us, and you can have the metahistorical sense. So that's what's so exciting about this narrative. All four modes of biblical interpretation, literal, anagogical, moral, allegorical, are all at play.
They're all present. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, this is great. Before I jump in and comment just briefly on the terms and categories as I understand them, I have a feeling that we're experiencing this over the course of our reading lives and such, from slightly different Christian backgrounds and upbringings and that kind of thing. I think, Matt, you and I have a little more in common there. As you were telling your story at the very beginning, that's extremely similar to my story. Growing up, evangelical American missionary kid and pastor's kid, in Reformed Calvinist tradition. It was, and then teaching theology at the high school level and some college adjunct courses. I just was perpetually, torn and never felt like but I'm wondering, Addison, you didn't grow up in American evangelicalism so much as Maryland Episcopalian. You may have had a slightly less traumatic kind of trajectory reading about this, or how would you contrast that in any way with what Matt and I are describing?
It's different, and you all paused for a second, so it's again, this router's not at its best. I would say in my own situation, I passed through something similar, because when I came back to faith, which was when I was about 17. It was through the charismatic renewal. And of course, there,
Mm-hmm.
I even went to a Bible institute until they kicked me out. I was, because I wouldn't stay away from my girlfriend. There were laws, and you know, she stayed, by the way, which shows you how wonderful that relationship actually was. But no, I was there for about 6 months. So this was Elam Bible Institute. So I had plenty of that kind of thing. But even then, having grown up in the Episcopal Church, I looked at it somewhat. I don't want to say cynically, but with a certain amount of I just not intellectually, I'm not there, and so I went pretty quickly back into my Anglicanism, um, and then very quickly into Anglo-Catholicism. The Most High Church and traditional. So I was reading, I think, when I was about through him, Irenaeus and all of that. So I would say if I was influenced at all deeply, it was from those directions and not from Reformed theology. Later on, I read Calvin. I mean, but this is years later. Theological. I read Calvin's commentaries and the institutes, and as much of the reformers as possible. But they've never been an influence in any deep way.
Good. Well, the way I would, a couple of categories I would throw out there. So I think the meta-historical human fall presumes something that's real outside of empirical time. But there's, I think, a variety of ways that gets articulated. Some of them are more kind of like a a parallel world or an alternative parallel history almost. In some of the early church fathers, the world before the fall is a story that gets disrupted and restarted in a sense, and the kind of laws of nature get changed. But you have a variety of things like that. I don't think that's the primary thing, like Sergei Bulgakov would be talking about, or even Bishop Basil Radzienko. They're very careful. Folks like Bulgakov are being very, very careful to stipulate that there's not so much a history before. It's not a prior
Yeah.
thing. It's an alongside of thing, which I think is more compatible with what you're saying, Addison. And it's primarily situated in the life of God. So, the eternal man is the fact that Bishop Basil Ratzienko gets into this a lot. His kind of thesis is that this is the heart of Cappadocian theology in his reading.
Yeah.
That as they were deeply engaged in expressing a Trinitarian doctrine, they saw the human image of God as Trinitarian, a reflection of the Trinitarian life, that were inextricably relational, connected, one, as a whole human race and being. And that, in fact, there's an eternal kind of humanity in God, in God's own Trinitarian life. There's a kind of eternal humanity there, and that's Adam. And sort of at the moment of Adam's receiving his own invitation, the human race receiving its invitation to begin enacting its own life, that it's always had in God, to speak in temporal terms. When you start saying that it's always had, it's hard to get out of temporal categories. But when humanity begins to receive its own life and to enact it, that's where I think Maximus and Sergei Bulgakov would be tending to say instantaneously, humanity makes the wrong choice collectively. And all of human history in empirical time, in our categories, is a playing out of this sort of collective wrong choice that we all then participate in across
Yeah.
all of time. And it has implications for the way the structures of the laws of this universe, literally are constituted from the Big Bang,
Yeah.
onward.
It-
And So it's not that there's a bunch of people running around before the Big Bang in some other kind of world, making decisions together,
Right.
but that collectively we do exist outside of empirical time, and uh, that we're enacting a sort of collective um, inclination that we had right from our sort of infancy, as it were, as creatures. We're enacting it in a fragmented and death-bound way, that's subject to entropy and decay and literal, a dispersion of time and space.
Wait, so you're saying there's like another me in a parallel universe kind of thing?
No, although I'm really into fairy tales and things like that, where in the realm of fairy, you get a lot
This
of
is very Charles Williams too. I mean,
you get a
you're
lot of that kind
haunted
of thing.
by your divinized self.
I mean, we
Very,
could
yeah.
get into ghost stories or fairy tales, and
Oh, a
I'm
good
not
ghost
I'm not.
story.
What's that?
I said, I know a good ghost stories book. I can tell you.
I mean, I think some of that has uh, has a place. I mean, it's worth talking about. But I'm when I talk about a meta-historical human fall and the Adam as the whole human race, what I'm understanding from like Bulgakov and even Bishop Basil Ratsienko is um, that it's um, not a particular person.
Yeah,
It's all of us in our collective
exactly.
um, reality, outside of time. And
And so
so,
he says we're fragments
yes, and that's one of my favorite things
of
about,
the original Adam.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of fascinating things in the book. The book is I kind of as I'm getting very, very close to the end of my I have to put translations in scare quotes because I don't know any Russian at all. I'm simply using a whole bunch of different large language model tools and really interrogating the text. And you can ask like, what's the etymology of this word in Russian? And what other thinkers use that term in their books? And
Yeah.
I've read enough Russian theology in good English translations to be able to put some stuff together that I think is interesting. But his book is all over the place, and there's lots of things I love and don't love. But it is he
He's
really.
no universalist, let's put it that way.
Well, he actually says Gregory of Nyssa's universalism is completely legitimate. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah, yeah. So actually, he's understandably very much a Slavophile. I mean, he's all about the Rus, the people of Russia. He spent 3 decades broadcasting a BBC radio program behind the Iron Curtain, while
Wow.
all of his dearest, friends and loved
Wow.
ones were being slaughtered. So when that
That explains the energy of the book.
yes, yeah,
It's just
when
exploding out of the
it
Soviet yoke.
opens
Yeah.
up, in
Yeah.
the 1990s, and he goes back and when they open up the most holy of holies kind of monastic community in Russia, the Sergei uh, Trinity Larva. I'm actually drawing a blank on the name. You'd probably know Addison. Um, but this holy monastery, he's invited to spend like a year there and give a
Wow.
series of lectures. And that set of lectures while he's living in this monastic community in a brand new kind of reopened up Russia turns into this book. So it is incredibly passionate Russian, kind of patriotic fervor that animates it. Although at that particular time, it's understandable. I mean, the Russian people have been through hell, and
Yeah.
they're just sort of being released from that particular period of devastation. And
Yeah.
he's quoting from authors. It's just fascinating. He's fascinated by Christian apologetics because he's been defending the
Yeah.
gospel from across the Iron Curtain for 3 decades in a BBC radio program.
Yeah.
But he's quoting these apologists who were killed in the Gulag and
Wow.
whose books were smuggled out,
Like
and some of
Florensky,
which were
right.
just starting to be published at the same time that his book is being
Yeah.
published.
Amazing.
So it's a fascinating historical document for sure, and that's my little bit of legitimate background. I have
Yeah.
some history training, and I'm just
Yeah.
fascinated by it at that level. But
And
the
it also explains why he's a little too rosy about Stephen Hawking. It's
Yes.
like, oh, he's just a theist in disguise. No, he's not.
No,
I
no.
mean,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. He's quite rosy and almost childlike in a variety of ways. He's a holy old man, and but he's got this kind of innocence and
yeah,
naivete even, at the same
yeah,
time. It's remarkable. And but he really hammers home this term fragments or shards, or the
yeah.
shattering of the original,
Yeah,
paradise Adam.
yeah.
And that
Which
Adam,
is right out of Hindu mythology, the Purusha, this cosmic man of which we are fragments.
yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, wow, talk about a compatibility
Yeah.
with Christian thought. Amazing.
Remember when I first read about the Purusha, it was exactly what came to my mind.
Yeah.
But actually, this brings us right back to 1 Corinthians 15, which I tend to think that, there's like a handful of the most important chapters in the Bible theologically, and that one is easily in the top five,
Mm,
um, because it deals with this whole thing of corporate man, if you will, to be in Adam, and to be in Christ, which is to be incorporated in Christ, to become one body with Christ, is because we're already one body with Adam. This is so essential to Pauline thought. That we have this. The way I used to try to explain original sin in when I was teaching catechism years ago was that it's not so much that original sin, if you want, or as the Orthodox call it, ancestral sin, is in us. It's that we are in it. We are
interesting.
in Adam. It's like we're like sponges that have been taken out of a bucket of dirty water, are being wrung out, which is what's happening if we're quote unquote being sanctified or purged or deified or glorified, and put in the context, if you want baptism, but put into Christ.
Mhm.
And it's being taken from one context, one corporate person, and put into another corporate person. And that's at the very heart. One is created, the other is your recreation,
Yeah.
and and to me that is perhaps the best understanding of redemption, or salvation, or whatever it is you want to call it, or just the continuation of creation, is this understanding of the corporate humanity in
Yeah.
Adam, in Christ. In Adam we die, in Christ we're made alive. And it's those two things. And I think Bishop Basil is pointing at the Cappadocians, obviously, are pointing in
Yeah.
that direction. You can't read the Cappadocians and not find 1 Corinthians 15, at least with its concepts, in the background all the
Yeah.
time. It's always there. So anyway, that I just thought I'd throw that into
But
the
but
mix.
Addison, I thought that when you develop contemplative inclinations, you just can be alone all the time. You never have to bother with other Christians or go to actual liturgical services.
Well, you know what? That's beautiful, and I thanks for helping me out, man. I've been looking.
There
No,
we
I
go. But
no,
it makes me,
that's the
this
thing
makes me
is,
want to go to church. When you
right,
say that, it makes me want to go to church. I love it.
right. Liturgy. I mean, this is why. This is why I love the Orthodox Divine Liturgy, for one thing. And I would say the same about Anglo-Catholic worship or Catholic
Yeah.
worship when it's at its richest. Is that what the liturgy is drawing you into a living drama,
Yes.
which is why the symbolism of who the priest is and everything actually is important, because you're being drawn into a drama where you in a sense see the high priest and the bridegroom of the church. You're going to be receiving that into yourself in the very body and blood of Jesus. I mean, I can't help it. I believe it's the real thing, and and when you do that, you are in a sense, through that union, that incorporation is real again. That is a real union with Christ, and yet you're doing it dramaturgically, if you will, right there in the liturgy, which is why liturgy is so essential. So, yeah, you don't contemplate there. you contemplate to get ready to do that,
Yes.
and that this is what I mentioned in a recent. This is where I disagree with Maggie Ross when she's, we
Yeah.
have to have contemplative liturgies. No, we don't. We need to have liturgies that bring you into it, but contemplation is what you do to get your heart and soul and mind ready for that. So.
And Addison, I loved that post because it helped me reconcile silent prayer. And it's like it felt like church was interrupting that, and it put me at peace about that. And I want to be sensitive about this. I know this is sensitive for a lot of people, but I want to say the fact that someone would make that argument means they don't hang around children very often.
Yeah.
It's like if you got kids in church, you're not going to have 20-minute swaths of silence.
Well,
Sorry, it's just not going to happen.
I was just at a couple of weeks ago. As you know, I'm Orthodox now, so I'm in the Divine Liturgy, and we got kids all over the place, and we don't have chairs. You don't sit in this church unless you're old, and then they have chairs there for the old people. But being the young man I am, I stand. But the children are running around, and they were doing a special akafist. Okay, sort of like a litany, but of hymns and everything. For those who aren't familiar with that lingo. And this little girl and other little children were all running around this, the very somber, chanting going on, and they're running up, and this little girl who has to keep going up to the icon of Jesus to kiss it. And of course, the mother has to chase after and lift her up and let her kiss the icon again for like the 10th or 15th time and take her back. And this is going on the whole time. And meanwhile, the chanting's, it's just a living reality. And of course, to me, that's what liturgy is, that's what it should be. And an expression of that corporate humanity that I was talking about. Anyway.
There's a wonderful priest at Holy Cross named I think he's at Holy Cross now, named George No, he's not a priest. I'm sorry, he's a professor. His name's George Parsinias. He was a Greek professor at Princeton Theological Seminary when I was there, and my wife and I walked into his house, and his daughter comes up and says, "Kiss the cross," and that's how we knew it was an Orthodox home. I love it. Oh God,
that's beautiful.
Yeah, that's called catechesis right there.
Yeah. Amen. On this topic of sort of corporate embodiment, which I do think is key kind of theologically, it doesn't help as much with the metaphysics or the science connections. But on the theological topic, your brother Addison, David, once recommended The Corinthian Body by Dale B. Martin, which I found to be an astonishing read. Are there any texts or kind of expositions of corporate embodiment? It's not an intuitive category for modern people, for
American individualists hate it. Right?
It's very counterintuitive to American individualism, to kind of post-enlightenment, thought. How do you help people to step into that?
I'll be honest. I have no books to recommend on that. I've never read Dale B. Martin, to be honest. I don't know anything really about him. I think he passed away. It's about the most that I can think of. But all of my thinking in that area, and I'm not trying to brag or anything, but most of my thinking has come literally from reading over the years the church fathers and reading usually Orthodox theologians, because I've been reading them forever. Beginning with Losky, I think, was my first, and so it just came that way.
Yeah, it permeates that literature.
And Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is a horrific deformation of that idea. You want to, in order to manipulate, control, and possess, rather than, and so modernity gets that. And of course you want to break out of that, and that explains individualism. I'm not part of mass society. I'm a Jungian individuating, realized self. It's like, no, this is, you don't. And that's one of the failures of Jungianism. It's for rich people who can afford psychoanalysis, right? Who can break off from the herd. Sorry, you are involved with the here comes everybody of the everyday liturgy. You're going to be unified with them if you're part of this Christian collective realization that we call the church. Very interesting.
To be fair to him, he said you wouldn't need his therapy if you went to church. So.
He sure did say that. Right. And that's a
Wow.
nobody, when you don't go, so you end up, it's going to be a lot cheaper to tithe than to pay a Jungian analyst.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Um, yeah, I mean, this kind of I'm glad you brought up Hobbes. There are enlightenment, but it's all based on power and will
Yeah.
rather than a kind of vision, right? So a common vision that binds us an experience. So a concrete experience, the Eucharist, and a vision of the kingdom that binds us together as one body versus a kind of will to power, or just straight up random decisions, imposed upon each other that bind us together. Um, well, I want to circle back on the metahistorical fall question specifically. One of the things that was kind of you know, it just shook me up and made me stay with the topic for a while was when I started to read some material that connected it directly to the Big Bang, just because it sort of crossed boundary lines between cosmological science and physics and theology, and that I think that's a helpful thing, sort of apologetically. It also can be a bit unhelpful and dangerous, confusing, or it can lead to, I mean, science, the Big Bang's just one theory out of many. It's not the sort of answer on cosmological origins or something from a science standpoint, but so there's various ways you can go wrong with this, but I have found it very helpful in chewing on the topic and talking about it. Bulgakov doesn't, Sergei Bulgakov, although he talks a lot about the metahistorical fall, does not connect it to the Big Bang. The theory wasn't really, the phrase hadn't been coined yet, so it just wasn't available to him. But that's all over the place in Bishop Basil Ratziengo's book. It's in the title of the book, and he makes a lot of connections there. And then there's a living contemporary paleontologist at Moscow University in Russia who's written an article in English that I think, at least I know, Matt, you've read.
Yeah. It's really helpful.
That talks about kind of preservism versus alterism, and he tries to split and analyze the church fathers, all the way through up through Augustine, with this one question of, did they believe that the human fall changed, kind of altered the laws of nature, as it were? And he asked that question, and he says they all were preservists. I'm sorry, the opposite. They were all alterists. They all believed that that the human fall changed the nature of kind of cosmic law and operation. Up through Augustine, and Augustine, he claims actually the early Augustine was an alterist, and then in his heavy debates with Pelagius, Augustine flipped and started to advocate a kind of preservism, that the human fall changes nothing as far as laws of, the laws of nature. And then that's kind of what we get generally stuck with as a default.
And
And I
even
thought
these,
that's a brilliant analysis. And he connects then the scholar's name, I should mention him. I actually shared your article on uh, Matt, your article with him, because he's very much against Teilhard.
well,
And he,
so am I to an extent. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank here. Alexander Krumov is
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
author's name that I'm talking about. He's a paleontologist. He's actually working on a second PhD in the history of evolutionary science, I believe. But he was amused by your article. He said, how can you try to sort of reconstitute or redeem, this godless fellow after his death, sort of call him back from the grave and justify him. And it was great, this kind of response he had. But I appreciated his analysis of the church fathers in this very simple kind of question that he asked, do the laws of nature change? And then that's how he approaches kind of connecting it to the Big Bang.
And what I was just I have a history of interrupting you on podcasts, Jesse. That's
This
the
is
way we do.
great.
But
Interruptions
what I
make
was
it alive.
gesticulating about is that it staggers me that no one seems to be presenting those options to students who want to perhaps become scientists and maintain their Christian faith. Altruism is because what happened was when you're presenting this view, it's like, okay, well, young earth creationism fixes everything because it's just you have, but they're imagining the Garden of Eden within the world as we know it, and then they can't explain the fact that that death enters the world, so they try to juke the stats fossil wise to make
Hmm.
that so, and it just doesn't work. And so what I have to do is I have to kind of give up on the Adam and Eve and and altruism, maybe because we're in this late Augustinian bubble, is just never presented as a possibility, even in these very sophisticated books that I just mentioned to you.
Yeah.
And I am staggered that this has not been presented to me earlier. And it's sort of, I mean, it's kind of embarrassing sometimes. I know that to scholars that some of the most interesting insights aren't going to happen in formal presses, but with someone using language models to translate something onto Substack, but so be it. Whatever it takes to get this information out there. Now, there are others. If people had read N.D. Williams, who's the Anglican theologian, early 20th century, he said all of this when he's faced with evolutionary biology as it's beginning to be unfurled.
Hmm.
His book is freely available. The Bampton Lectures 101 years ago, 1924, published in 1927, The Ideas of the Fall and of Original Sin. And if you go to the archive.org and look at that book, page 34 to 35, he summarizes his whole argument. And he says it all, that,
Wow.
that this world, as we know it, with its nature red in tooth and claw,
Yeah.
is not part of God's original design. And
Yeah.
that, for a sophisticated Christian in the 21st century, was saying, well, now you're kind of in young earth creationist territory. Not in the least.
Hmm.
This actually but it enables me to be horrified at some of the phenomenon of nature. And that horror that caused Charles Darwin to lose his faith, compounded with the loss of a child, etc. That horror is something I should embrace as a Christian. That
Hmm.
I am shocked. I am offended
Yeah.
by the reign of death in this cosmos. And
Yeah.
I'm allowed to be. But guys, I said I had a surprise. That's not even my surprise.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
but I mean, should I reveal it now?
I'm ready. That
Okay.
you've built
All
up
right.
to it. I thought that was it because
No,
I'm
no,
not
no,
sure
no.
to go
There's more because
read this text.
that I mentioned in the Terre de Chardin piece, but this, okay. I wow. Get ready. I'm just going to start reading it, and soon you will know what I'm quoting from. Okay. Then Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled. And he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm. Pause. There was the first theme that was good, and then Melkor created an evil theme, returning to the passage. And yet, unlike to the former theme, this third theme gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it. And again, there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again, Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others, for it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. This third theme was able to take the evil second theme and weave it into itself. You know what I'm quoting from.
Sax
So
Romer. Oh, no,
it,
Silmarillion, of course.
exactly. That's right. You're right. And isn't, I mean, I was stunned. Christopher Tolkien edits it. Tolkien was working on it his whole life. And after Tolkien died, it got published. And I was listening to that, and we had a long car ride, and I was just like, that's it.
There you go.
That we are living in the third theme.
Hmm.
And is that not gorgeous that we see a world that is evil and awful in so many ways, and yet the beauty shines through it. The first theme shines through it. And the gospel is the third theme that
Yeah.
is weaving the worst thing that could possibly happen, the crucifixion of the most beautiful person who ever lived, is
Hmm.
being woven into Romans 8:28. Is that not gorgeous? So
Mhm.
Tolkien had it, right? He was there.
Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah.
that's my
Yeah,
surprise.
I hadn't read the Silmarillion for years, but when you read it, it's like, well, I wonder how much
Yes.
of that soaked into my mind and yours, at an earlier stage, and only now are we seeing the influence, for where some of these ideas come from. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Right. And it enables us to take Lewis's fantastic imagination and to like Platonism takes on real flesh when you think about it. And you know what I mean? In the sense of all this other realm kind of stuff is not just mythology. It
Mm.
really is there. All these things really are true. And
Yeah.
I'm kind of embarrassed for the Christians who, in the name of being up to date scientifically, have proven the six-day creationists right in the evisceration of their faith in
Yeah.
order to maintain scientific respectability. In this view, you don't have to do any of that because I was thinking how funny it is that here we are. We don't have a scientist on this panel discussing it. We don't need one because all of this is outside, as Bishop Basil says over and over again, the realm of even the most competent scientist there could possibly be.
Right.
No scientific instrument is ever going to find this. And that's where, thank goodness Paul Griffiths is clear on that in his book, Decreation. We have other, there are Catholic representatives of this thesis as well, thank goodness. But you have the Anglicans, you have the Catholics, you have the Orthodox coming right out of the hell of Soviet communism before Russia was plunged into the current hell that it's in.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so this brief window of splendor before where we are now. And oh my gosh, it's just we need these ideas. I need these ideas. They strike me as fundamentally not fashionable, but true.
Well,
Yeah.
it's one of the things you can do is, I point people constantly, go back and read, like you did, from what was it, the Bampton Lectures of
Yeah,
1920 something. And I would say, go back and read G.L. Prestige's Bampton Lectures of 1940 or whatever. There's so much to be gleaned from these writers that we have, in a sense, forgotten. I'm thinking now Charles Gore, and mainly Anglicans in my mind, but these writers that were actually
totally.
wrestling with this stuff. Alston Farrer, another one,
Right.
were
Hmm.
wrestling with all of these questions, and they were doing this 70, 80 years ago or earlier, and we forget their writings, but you go back and you read them, and it's right up to the minute. Yes, they're somewhat dated, but they were struggling with a lot of these same issues, and we've forgotten their arguments. But if you go
Yeah.
back and you read them, there they are. And I've got
Yeah.
like about, I don't know, 50 or 60 volumes here of those kinds of people, and just in back of me here. And I've gleaned more from reading, and Tolkien would be obviously one of them in the area of fiction. But it's not that these people, that this stuff wasn't being said or written about earlier. It's just we haven't been reading them, and
Right.
Yeah.
especially if we come from what shocks me is like is Anglicans who don't read the old uh, their earlier writings.
Yeah. There's some.
Orthodox who are so involved in trying to develop the Orthodox phronema, you know, that they're actually not reading the Orthodox theologians of,
Yeah.
of the
Right.
past century. So
Yeah, I think that's a vital point. I mean, there's a wealth there, and we're just missing it. And we're distracted by whatever the aftermath is for decades of the Scopes trial, or, all these dramatic confrontations.
Oh,
And
what a
and we
disaster.
can't we can't realize in the literary realm and the theological realm, there are resources there. Have either of you ever read Peter Green, an Anglican priest, wrote a book in 1920,
Yeah,
The Problem of Evil?
I
You know
think
what? I
that was,
think I
go
did,
ahead.
but that would be like about almost 50 years ago in my case. So that's, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I just,
Well, I think he has a very articulate exposition of what's an awful lot like a meta-historical human fall. Again, just I think there's multiple examples, and I love your surprise from Silmarillion, from the second word, Luvatar. I knew
yeah,
what you were reading, and it's beautiful. And the literary material is rich. Chesterton in the Ballad of the White Horse, just one little line. For the end of the world was long ago, and all we who dwell today, as children of some second birth, like a strange people left on earth after a judgment day. Um,
Wow.
that's just so you have these
Wow.
rich literary references from Chesterton, from Tolkien, to this understanding of our entire cosmos as after the judgment day, a third theme, that's a tug of war, Addison, I think you're using that term between, the kingdom of God and chaos, or, so you've got these rich.
Here's another one. The whole world is our hospital, endowed by the ruined millionaire, wherein if we do well, I can't wait, what's the rest? If we do well, we shall die of absolute paternal care, which will not leave us but prevents us everywhere. For quartets, right?
Mhm,
The ruined millionaire is Adam,
yeah, yeah.
mhm.
and this and this is where we get worried, because it's not surprising that Origen would therefore seem to, it's hard to say, seem to also come to the conclusion that we chose this, right? That we had a pre-existence and then we're kind of thrust into this place. And I don't think you have to necessarily come to that conclusion. That we were, pre-existence is not a corollary to this position. I don't think so.
Yeah, no, most of the theologians I'm, talking about are keen to say it's not about
No.
pre-existence. We're talking about time as we experience it, empirical history, the totality of time as we experience it being a result of something that's outside of time as we experience it. It's not prior to,
Yeah.
it's alongside of, within, above,
Yeah.
whatever kind of, but it's not a before and after kind of relationship.
And you need the power of the sacraments
Yep.
is your gateway to that other world. It can't just be communing with the spark within. I was reading
Yep.
Evelyn Underhill writing about George Fox's inner light, and she has a great line. She's like, I think his inner light would have burned a lot more brightly if it had been closer to the lamp. Right? In other words, if it had been ensconced in the liturgical tradition.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, so I want to echo a little bit of the frustration you've referred to, I think, Matt, of just kind of why aren't there more theologians? And I think there are, not that scientists would talk about this as scientists, because I agree with you, it's not
They can't.
subject to
Yeah.
science.
Yeah.
But why aren't theologians making the case that it's legitimate for scientists to hold positions like this? And there, Alexander Krumov's kind of the only significantly published scientist. He's a distinguished paleontologist, in the Russian world. He's published in English as well, but he's making the case. But there's so few examples of scholars in theology or science. I think things like pre-existence, things like, maybe misunderstandings of what Origen actually taught, or just Origen's where he was wrong, whatever that might be. That's a little hard to distinguish. But what are the things that kind of hold back? I've read Christopher Southgate's probably one of the most distinguished living scholars on the problem of evil. He wrote The Groaning of Creation. He's published a more recent book with Oxford University Press on the topic, and he explicitly talks like a lot like Tilliard the sort of Alexandrian option. And he engages it just a tiny bit, but he says basically, like, that's just, crazy mythology, and we just can't go there. Um, but I feel like these
Oh, but
folks,
we can
yes,
and
and
will.
I feel like they're dismissing it though for sort of elementary misunderstandings, like it's got to come with pre-existence, or it's got
No,
to
it doesn't.
come with some kind of a literal idea of, um, fleshly beings running around in an alternative universe or something. Whereas,
Well,
or
we're surrounded by an alternative universe all the time, and that's what we call the spiritual realms. It's as
Mhm.
simple as that. When we talk about the angelic or the spirits, the transfiguration with the appearance of Elijah and Moses and things, you know,
Mhm.
we are talking about an alternative universe, if you will. It's what we mean when we say, "I believe in God who created the invisible and the visible and the invisible." That there is an invisible realm to us.
Mhm.
It's
Right.
beyond our perception, our material perceptions. So
And it's
anyway,
not always in our favor.
no, definitely not. No.
Yeah. One of the things Bishop Basil Radzienko says is that a mechanistic kind of understanding of the world actually dematerializes. It actually makes the material world unsubstantial. And it's really hard to translate. He's using some technical philosophical, metaphysical terms in Russian there, but it struck me that this idea, this sort of denial of the substantiveness of the spiritual realm, spiritual embodiment and the substantialness of that actually robs materiality of its substantialness. Um,
Huh.
and because this is another way I think people are afraid of this idea of a meta-historical human fall, is it gets into pre-existence or that kind of thing. That's one issue. But another is it robs materiality of any it denies the incarnation or something. They're worried that it kind of makes the
No.
material world insubstantial. In fact, I feel that it gives the material world its
Yeah,
substantiality.
I mean, it seems to me that the problem is we have to concede the point to some extent. The material world that we encounter is insubstantial in a sense. If
Yes.
by that we mean that in and of itself,
Yeah.
it has the wherewithal to exist, the wherewithal to be preserved, to even be transformed. There has to be. It's the most ephemeral thing we know. This is what we mean when we say we're going to die. We're all going to go back to nothingness. Basically, the only thing that keeps us in existence is that which stands under this material reality. So we are looking for something more substantial. And certainly the Christian view is that the spiritual realm is more substantial than the
Mhm.
material realm.
Mhm.
That our being rests on that. It's like the Big Bang. Where does that come from? You ask a scientist who believes that the Big Bang occurs, and you say what was before the Big Bang, and they look at you, kind of stymied. Well, nothing. There was nothing there. Well, we actually say there was. you know,
Mhm.
uh, we didn't simply come out of nothing. We were brought into being by that which is more substantial than the creation that we have. And so in that sense, I would say that we can concede the point. Yes, the material creation is insubstantial if it's seen in and of itself as the
Mhm.
only thing that exists.
Mhm.
There's no reason we should even believe that it should exist. Um,
Which is why it never satisfies us.
it
Why
can't.
when you finally get the best glass of wine you've ever had, or the most incredible travel experience, anyone who's had it's always going to leave you just a little bit hollow. It's
Yeah.
supposed to be that way.
Good point.
Havel Havalim, right?
Something.
Well, it's
Addison's,
the C.S. Lewis Sehnsucht.
of course.
Mhm.
And that's and all of and maybe that's one of the reasons this radiates so strongly in the Anglican tradition, in Williams, in Lewis, in Tolkien, because they still held on to that Platonist understanding, the Christianized Platonism,
Yeah.
that we, as much as we might celebrate them, I think we're hesitant to go all the way there, and we need to.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we probably need to start rereading Pseudo Dionysius is what we probably should be doing.
Oh my gosh, guys, I got to tell you this. I was hoping to run into Pierre Teilhard Chardin again. I was next to the Field Museum. I was at the Adler Planetarium.
More
You know,
ghosts than I do.
yeah, and lo and behold, he did not show up. But I did find this Stephen Hawking book for sale right by the toys in the kids section, and I'm like, are you serious? And it's brief answers to big questions. It's the only book that was on the table, and I pick it up, and here's what he said. This is, we're talking about the overly rosy view of Bishop Basil about Hawking. He says, quote, I use the word, quote unquote, God in an impersonal sense, as Einstein did, for the laws of nature. So knowing the mind of God is knowing the laws of nature. My prediction is that we will know the mind of God by the end of this century. I'm like, oh my, just take I know you're brilliant, but could you just take 5 minutes and read one paragraph of Pseudo Dionysius?
Yeah.
And you will be cured of that ridiculous sophomore level theology, which is an insult to sophomores forever. But it's just, there's a lack of imagination. And so unfortunately, and he says, oh, and because I am disabled, the religious people of the world would have cast me aside or looked upon me. Hold on now. The dignity of people made in the image of God, regardless of their infirmities, is something that religion brought into the world, the Christian religion first and foremost. I'm like, he just doesn't understand it. And so that's, as people assimilate this document that Jesse's bringing forth, we've got to understand we can do better than Hawking.
Yep.
I say it with reverence. I know he's brilliant.
Yeah.
But he's not brilliant theologically.
Yeah, Bishop Basil says if he's got any kind of religion, it's maybe a kind of Western stealing from, a kind of shallow stealing from, maybe some Buddhist or thought, but he's trying to operate without religion, and he's anti-religion. But Bishop Basil says his own kind of mathematics and points beyond the laws of nature as we experience them, which I think is why he's, what he's seeing as kind of an opportunity in Hawking's. He's particularly interested in imaginary time, or I think Hawkins uses the term vertical time as well. So
it was the conversation partner he had.
Yeah, time has kind of more than one dimension to it, is where he enters in. But he's almost, Bishop Basil's almost childlike in his and he's reverential. I mean, he speaks of him what's the word?
Hagiographically, right? Totally.
And that's the great sufferer of our day. I mean, that's hagiographic language.
That's beautiful. That's
astonishing.
Beautiful.
Because you're right, he's no friend of the Christian faith, but. One other thing, we probably should wrap up, but this is just so much fun, and I am tempted to throw one other thing on the table. I feel like sometimes this gets accusations of a kind of Gnosticism as well. That the world is the creation of a broken humanity. So what kind of a world would a shattered humanity kind of call into existence? It's this world. And as co-creators, there's another Tolkien connection, co-creation or participation in our own creation. Fichte and Bulgakov have a lot of that. And Bishop Basil, by the way, references a lot of Fichte. He talks a lot about, he doesn't name Fichte, but he's clearly taking that from Bulgakov, I think. But that participation in a creation where, in some sense, the things that are wrong about this world are what we and maybe other elemental powers, in our fallenness, are introducing into it in a false way. Kind of introducing into the gaps, the points of incompletion. We're introducing false realities that ultimately don't stand, but that are incredibly brutal and just destructive forces in the world as we know it. And that's then, the attack or the kind of concern is, well, you're introducing a kind of Gnostic vision, and I would say no, because it is a tug of war, between no part of life in this fallen world is separated from the cross of Christ, and the suffering
Right.
of God. God descends to the very depths and suffers with us in every moment of our suffering. And that prevents any kind of, ultimate separation between.
Lamb slain from the foundation of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're not separate worlds ultimately. They're not, there's not a good world and a bad world. There's God's world, and then there's our attempts to distort and lie about God's world. But how do you respond to that kind of concern of if the Big Bang is in some sense a result of a primordial or meta-historic human fall, in whatever sense that might be a legitimate claim, that's kind of a dark Gnostic vision.
But the Gnostic, go ahead, Addison.
No, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I mean, briefly, I want to hear what you say, but I'm with Irenaeus in his attack on Gnosticism as it had presented itself at that point as a challenge to the Christian church and a challenge to the idea that the word became flesh. Full stop, right? Irenaeus is right. They're wrong in that sense. But that quote unquote small g Gnostic elements of Christian gnosis that impregnate the New Testament are, of course, completely on terms. And Bishop Basil quotes this Gnostic saying, "The ruler of this world is coming, and he has no claim on me." John 14:30, right? If you're going to call that Gnostic, sorry, that's in the New Testament. And that is it. In this view enables me to take that very seriously. That Jesus is saying that Satan is the prince of the air. He's the ruler of this world. He runs the show. And I don't have to mature out of that as a early evangelical view before I became intelligent and sophisticated. No, I have to grow into that and watch my soul. Nepsis, right? The stuff that Addison writes about, the stuff that the Philokalia proclaims. Watch out, because at every moment there I am a threatened being. And Jesus is giving all of us what is required to triumph and overcome. But we are in a dangerous world, not just dangerous physically. Physical dangers in some senses are the least of our worries. So what if I die? If I sin, that's the danger. That's the danger. And one last quick caveat. Addison and I were chatting a little bit about this. It is funny how in all of this discussion about universalism that has come up, I feel like I'm just going to quote the parts of Bulgakov where he talks about hellfire. And they could come right out of Jonathan Edwards. They terrify me. Even if you are a universalist, there's nothing about a serious universalist position that you should actually, that would prevent you in any way from talking about just how dangerous it is to be in a state of sin, to be alienated from God. Harden not your hearts, the Anglicans read every morning if they do their divine office. Harden not your hearts as in the day at Meribah. This is a spiritual battle. All this does is it renews all of the ligaments of traditional Christian teaching and electrifies them in new ways to put us all on the path of making it to the end without severing that lifeline between ourselves and God. And that's what the church is for. So a couple of things. I'm just not troubled by the Gnostic accusation. I would never yield all that territory to them.
Yeah. No, I concede all that. That I agree with entirely, what you just said. I think for me, again, if you my own way of looking at it, which isn't just peculiar to me, it's that I don't identify the Big Bang with the fall. I identify it with creation, and the fall being something which accompanies creation almost necessarily, given what it is that we are being created out of. So for me, it's almost a false start, if you will, to say that the Big Bang somehow, if you is somehow identified with the fall, and that's where I would say I do not follow that particular version of the meta-historical narrative but the rest of it, I'm entirely on the same page, especially Matt, with what you just said. I agree with that entirely. Which is one reason I'm careful when I talk about universalism, because I don't want anyone to ever get the wrong impression that I do not fear hell as a reality. In fact, I do, and should, and so should everyone. Hell is basically the state of choosing uncreation for yourself, in some sense, choosing to go backwards. And whether God will let you do that or not is a different story. But you're going to go through hell if you do choose that. And that's what we should be constantly praying against. And harden not your heart, Psalm 95, the invitatory psalm every day, is a perfect thing to start the day with.
Gosh. And Addison, I think you're giving, and again, I'm not trying to turn this into a debate about universalism, but there's sort of a new universalism, fundamentalism that has surfaced with less than intelligent representatives chiming in on Facebook posts. And when I see that, I say, that's one of the reasons I resist universalism, because one of the reasons it was resisted for so long is because of the impact it can have on the church, the corrosion and the free pass that it seems to offer people who don't want to reconcile themselves with God. And I'm like, I'm watching this unfold, and I'm like, see, this is why I'm a little, I hold back.
We're living at a time, and I'll just say this, and then I won't say another word about it. We're living at a time where the chasm between Christianity as it has been given to us by Christ and the apostles, and something else, which is going under the same name, is getting wider and wider. And we need to be aware of that, because the other side is basically not simply being universalist and saying that, hell is still a reality you want to avoid. It's basically saying there is no such place, that we're accepted as we are. God loves us, and that's just, we don't have, and that is,
talk to my wife about whether or not she wants that to be the case. Yeah.
It's nice. I'd like it to be the case. Wouldn't it be wonderful? But that's not the New Testament, and it's not the Father. It's not the church.
It's a kind of crazy alternative way of denying the human fall. To say that there wasn't a fall because actually we're all just fine. It's insane.
Which you can look at the world and say, please tell me what universe you're living in. Do you watch
real quick, just a quick quote from Evelyn Underhill again. She said, as she grew in her sanctification, she was wrestling with her own inner demons, with her sin. And she says, I used to be a white hot Neoplatonist. And now that I've grown a little bit, I cannot imagine that Plotinus had to deal with his own beastliness.
Wow.
How wonderful to be a Neoplatonist where I don't have to deal with the sinner that I am. That's Christian mysticism, which is one of the reasons I can't unsubscribe from Addison's Substack. Oh my gosh, it's just so good. You need a little,
I second that. If I can steal one more question of you, Addison, because I think I see a slight difference. I know between my thought on the origins of our cosmos and something you said just moments ago. Would you in any way think that the sort of laws of our cosmos, the mechanical functions of it, as it were, from its origins, whatever those are in the Big Bang or whatever, are distorted in some way? That feels like kind of my best attempt at a very pointed question to kind of get at, I think, some of, the focus I'm reading and my own thinking. The cosmos has, like the law of entropy, for example, there's things that aren't laws made by God in the functions of our cosmos. Where would you weigh in on that?
The only analogy I could make at that is if you look at a chrysalis, it's not a butterfly, and in order for it to become a butterfly, something has to die.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at, I mean, Polkinghorne, John Polkinghorne says things along these lines, and I think that the death and resurrection is interwoven in the creation as it is. That in other words, what we see embodied in Jesus is what we also see, happening with the entire creation. That there's out of death comes life, and that's the ultimate hope. And that in a sense, we're in a chrysalis stage, there's maybe a kind of a block universe picture in your mind as far as God's concerned, it's a fait accompli, it's all good. He created it and he pronounces it good. We're in the context of transformation from that which is to that which will be, deified and glorified. So for us, it looks like billions and billions of years, and we've got this idea of time, and it's taking so long. And from God's perspective, He's in the Sabbath rest, and that's where we're heading. So what I see happening is not so much that it's distorted; it's that it's not yet fully created. It's only half baked, or maybe a quarter baked, or maybe 3/4 baked. I don't know, but we're heading towards something else, and that's to talk in a mythological language, and maybe in some ways, it's getting somewhat back to the Tolkien image of you've got one theme, you've got discord. Maybe that discord was those same notes were there at the beginning that are now discordant, but there's a third theme coming in, which is going to take it. So it becomes a symphony, and that's what we're in the process of becoming. So I don't know if that answers anything, but it's sort of how I look at it. So,
well, Addison, let me just quote Bishop Basil, who says something very similar. This is from the translation that the English preface that preceded Jesse's work that you quote, Jesse. The world is not only interesting, the world is endlessly beautiful. And one must love its beauty, its development, its evolution towards perfection and goodness. One must love mankind as well as all of God's lower creatures, everything and everybody struggling with evil, both in oneself and outside.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that's Teilhard at his best got that.
Yeah.
He got that. He's like, and I think he was protesting against the limitations presented to him by a desiccated Neotomism. And the fact that he didn't get all the way to where we are right now, God is unfolding things for the church in time. He was part of it. Did he get everything right? Absolutely not. But I think we have more light thanks to this work that you're doing, Jesse, of bringing forth this witness, at least in the Anglophone world, that was lost to us.
Well,
thanks for that.
That's overly flattering, but delightful. So I'm just so happy and grateful to you two for chit-chatting about all of this and bringing a whole bunch of other voices in, literary figures, theological figures, pointing to a lot of rich heritage that we have that we, I think we all agree we aren't kind of calling upon and celebrating as much as we could in in this day and age. So I hope we might inspire a few other folks, whether popular, thinkers, writers, or even a few scholars. Like I guess only one of the three of us on this call, really, but to do some work.
Well, gee, thanks, Jesse.
You're a churchman, right?
Because
Addison?
that's all I am. Of course, the realm of scholarship is all virtue and brilliance, and that's everyone there is a gleaming figure, a paragon of what it.
Yes, well, I'm not holding contemporary academia up as a gleaming paragon by any means, but formal calling or whatnot.
The ecclesiastical institutions as paragons of virtue.
Of course, absolutely.
Paragons of virtue are few and far between. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight, and I hope you have wonderful days or evenings, depending on the time zone you're in.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse.
Bye.